Good day. Today, 30th November 2023, we're coming to the end of another month in the period of the special military operation, and another month in this year, 2023, which had been widely expected at the start of this year to mark the year when Ukraine would achieve its victory over Russia. I remember that it was about this time that euphoria was very high in the West after Ukraine's purportedly successful offensives in Kharkiv and in Kherson region. A few weeks before, back in September 2022, General Zaluzhny gave his interview with The Economist, in which he spoke about the fact that he needed 350 tanks, 600 to 700 infantry fighting vehicles, and 500 howitzers to win the war by an advance through the land bridge which would cut off Crimea. Then in the early winter, after the new year, there was a meeting in Ramstein with decisions taken to supply Ukraine with heavy armor, Leopard 2 tanks, eventually Abrams tanks. We'll be hearing more about those. Challenger 2s, Marder infantry fighting vehicles, Bradley infantry fighting vehicles, Stryker wheeled infantry fighting vehicles. We hear far less about those, by the way. I suspect that they have not been able to withstand the rigors of Ukrainian conditions. And of course, Ukraine also got self-propelled guns, lots of other forms of military equipment. And as I well remember, around this time last year, and for several weeks that ensued, optimism was high that 2023 was going to be, for Ukraine, a victorious year. Well, so far, it's turned out otherwise. In the first part of 2023, in the winter, Russia launched its missile offensive against Ukraine's energy system. I've suggested that the missile offensive might have been primarily intended to deplete Ukraine's air defense system, which it seems to have been relatively successful in doing. The West has sent a hodgepodge of air defense systems to Ukraine to try to fill the gaps, but most acknowledge that this isn't providing Ukraine with anything like the comprehensive coverage that it needs. And the Russians, for their part, appear to be stockpiling more missiles and are able to engage in nightly drone attacks with uranium-2 drones, which have a big impact in terms of the damage they do, but at very low cost to the Russians. So that offensive, that missile offensive, began last year, and we also get reports now, more reports, that the damage to the energy system that was affected last year by the Russian missile offensive has never been fully repaired. And I saw that John Helmer, for example, who covered that missile offensive, in my opinion, in the most thorough and insightful way last year. Anyway, he's now published a further piece in which he speculates, he predicts that the Russians will indeed renew their offensive against the Ukrainian energy system this year, even as temperatures fall, and with all the indications are being that, unlike last year, this year the winter will be a cold one. So there was that happening, and that, of course, did significant damage to Ukraine, to its economic system. And then, of course, through the winter and the spring, there was this bitter battle in Bakhmut. The Ukrainians committed huge numbers of men to trying to defend Bakhmut, where the Wagner organization was pressing them hard, backed by the rest of the Russian military. But despite all attempts to hold back the Russians, Bakhmut, by May of this year, fell. But nonetheless, optimism remained strong. People were saying, well, the Russians might have captured Bakhmut. Perhaps the Ukrainians overinvested in the defense of Bakhmut. But there would be the great Ukrainian counteroffensive of the summer, and that would somehow reverse the situation. It would lead to, if not a full breakthrough all the way down to the Sea of Azov, at least to Ukraine making significant gains and keeping the Russians, or pushing the Russians back on the back foot. And Ukraine did launch its great summer counteroffensive. And of course, formally, that counteroffensive is continuing. The Ukrainians have never announced that the counteroffensive itself has actually ended. But anyway, they did launch this great counteroffensive through the summer, through June, July, August, September, October, and it achieved very little. A few deserted villages were captured. Tens of thousands of Ukrainian soldiers appear to have lost their lives or been wounded, and hundreds of tanks and armored vehicles were destroyed, and the Ukrainian army has been left in a critical condition. And over the last few weeks, since October, the Russians have been going further on the attack. And in October, they began their offensive around Avdiivka. I'll be saying more about that shortly. They'd already started some time before their counterattack around Kupiansk. And again, I'll be saying something about that too. And they also have been conducting offensives in other places, in the Vremivka salient, for example, but most especially and most dramatically in the last few weeks, especially the last 2 weeks, in the Bakhmut area. And now we're getting reports about the Ukrainian army being massively under strength, indicative of the very heavy losses that Ukraine has suffered over the course of this year, and of the heavy equipment losses as well. And yesterday, the European Union again confirmed that Ukraine would not get all the million shells that it was promised, that it would be provided within the space of a year. It seems only 300,000 shells have been supplied by the European Union. And the European Union is saying that it will not get its shells by March of 2024, that it will have to wait several more months before the entire supply of shells is provided to Ukraine in fulfillment, in rather non-fulfillment of that promise made in March of this year. I would add, by the way, that there is a great deal of misunderstanding and misrepresentation about this issue of shells. It is absolutely the case that Ukraine did not get the million shells from the European Union that it was promised. Those million shells were not, in my opinion, intended to be supplied over the course of an entire year. They were intended to be supplied to Ukraine, specifically for use in the offensive that took place in the summer. And when it became obvious that Ukraine would not be, that the EU would not be able to supply Ukraine with all these shells. The United States decided to fill the gaps. It could not supply Ukraine with 1 million shells or anything like that from its own reserves, which are now massively depleted. So it went to its ally, South Korea, instead. It borrowed 500,000 shells from South Korea. It pretended that these were intended to make up the difference for the shell depletion suffered by the United States. But in reality and in practice, it seems that this entire stock of 500,000 South Korean shells was supplied to Ukraine. So maybe Ukraine didn't get quite as many shells on the eve of its offensive as it expected to get. The European Union obviously fell far short, but it still probably had something like 1 million shells, some supplied by the United States directly from its remaining stocks, some taken by the United States from its reserves, its stockpiles in Israel, but also shells supplied by the United States, but ultimately originating in South Korea. I don't think that Ukraine began its offensive on the 4th of June without having the stockpile of shells it was promised. But the shells that it did get, the 500,000 shells from South Korea, all the other shells that it got from the US as well, from Israel, they weren't anywhere near enough, and the Ukrainian army now suffers from a very severe shell shortage and from a very severe equipment shortage. We see that there are now multiple reports from the Ukrainian battlefields that Ukrainian military units are now severely depleted in terms of manpower, that the men are exhausted, that this is becoming extremely difficult, therefore, for them to continue the war. We're getting more and more reports. There was one by Abdi Alaudinov, the Chechen military chief on the Russian side. He said that the Russians have noticed for some time that the Ukrainians have reduced their level of shelling, their rate of shelling on the battle lines to minimal levels. And the Ukrainians have to some extent tried to make up for this shell shortage by increasing their use of FPV drones. And we see many of them now being used by Ukraine on the battlefronts. But of course, FPV drones carry a far smaller amount of explosive than shells do. And they are subject to jamming by the Russians, which of course shells launched by tube artillery generally are not. And they're not really a sufficient or proper alternative to shells, of which Ukraine is now severely short. And Ukraine is probably short of other equipment also. We've seen many pictures of Leopard 2 tanks burning in various parts of the battlefronts. Leopard 2s were the most important tank supplied by the Western powers in the winter and spring. The intention was to use them to break through in the south towards the Sea of Azov, but they're now being deployed in all sorts of places. The survivors, I should say, are now being deployed to all sorts of places. They've been deployed to Avdiivka, they've been deployed to Kupiansk, and more of them are being destroyed in these places. Germany has apparently now managed to get 25 old Leopard 2s from Switzerland. the intention is that, because this is clearly the intention, that these Leopard 2s will be refurbished by the German military and will be inducted into the German military, and that will enable the Germans to supply 25 more Leopard 2s from their own stockpile. But nobody seriously imagines that that's going to make a difference. And given the number of Leopard 2s destroyed, given the immense damage done to Ukraine's depleting tank fleet, and by the way, I've seen, every day one sees pictures of Ukrainian tanks being destroyed. There was film yesterday of 2 Ukrainian tanks being attacked and destroyed by Lancet drones, Russian Lancet drones, on the West Bank in Kherson region. Anyway, because Leopard 2s are in short supply, perhaps also because Britain is now unhappy about the prospect of Challenger 2 tanks, the 14 Challenger 2 tanks that Britain supplied being seen destroyed. 1 Challenger 2 has already been destroyed, so the 13 Leopard Challenger 2s are apparently being kept back in reserve. It's not clear what they're doing, if anything. The Abrams tanks, the 31 Abrams tanks that the United States is supplying to Ukraine, apparently they are now starting to appear on the battlefronts close to Kupiansk. But there was an article today by David Axe at Forbes telling us about the heavy maintenance problems involved with these American tanks, that the filters of these tanks need to be kept clean. He explains the method by which this is done. He says this has to be done twice a day, or the tank will simply break down, its engine will become unusable. The engine is temperamental and fragile. Well, I suspect that Ukrainian soldiers have been instilled with the importance of cleaning these filters, and from the way David Axe describes it, that task is not perhaps excessively complicated. But perhaps the most interesting thing about this whole discussion of the Abrams tanks is the sheer amount of energy, fuel that these tanks need. And it seems that the engine is extremely inefficient. It's very high use. And it seems that the entire tank looks to me completely inappropriate for use on the Ukrainian battlefields. And I am deeply skeptical that the United States seriously intends to supply many more. So there we go. A very difficult situation for Ukraine. All the high hopes of this year, of 2023, have been dashed. None of the victories that were expected have been achieved. The one important town that has been captured this year is Bakhmut, which has been captured by the Russians. And it is likely that at some point in the next couple of weeks or months, Avdiivka will follow, also captured by the Russians, not by Ukraine. And everywhere else, on every other part of the front lines, the Ukrainians are at a standstill, at best, or in retreat at worst. Well, let's just summarize the latest information from the battlefronts. We haven't had quite the dramas that we saw and which I discussed yesterday, but the situation continues to deteriorate. It continues to get worse. The various Ukrainian sources yesterday tried to deny the Russian capture of Khromovo, Virtually every single Russian report, however, confirms that the Russians have indeed captured Khromovo, a village of about 1,000 people near Bakhmut. So I called it a small village. It turns out that it was not actually quite so small as I assumed. But anyway, Khromovo has, all the indications are, definitely been captured. I've never known a case so far in this war where the Russian Defense Ministry reported a place captured which had not been captured, and they confirmed yesterday that Khromovo has indeed been captured. So Khromovo has been captured. Dima at the military summary channel says that this is all part of a plan by the Ukrainians in the northern flanks of Bakhmut to retreat to higher ground, that they realized that Khromovo was undefendable because it was on lower ground, and so they withdrew from Khromovo, presumably in good order, to take up more defendable positions further west. I have to say I'm going to express some skepticism about this. It is likely that the Ukrainians have indeed been forced back to higher ground, but I doubt that it was quite as carefully planned as Dima of the military summary channel thinks. The reason I don't think that is because there are now reports again from Russian sources, and apparently this film starting to appear, film by the way which I choose not to see, which apparently shows Khromovo full of dead Ukrainian bodies, pictures of the dead bodies of Ukrainian soldiers. Now that strongly suggests to me not an organized withdrawal, but a chaotic one of the Russians pushing into Khromovo, the Ukrainian resistance there collapsing in a disorganized way. And since then, there have been further reports that the Russians have been pushing on further west towards Bogdanovka, this other village further to the west, which, if it's captured, as I discussed in my program yesterday, I think that will have a decisive impact on the conduct of the battle in Bakhmut, in and around Bakhmut. And yesterday there were reports that the Russians were shelling Bogdanovka heavily. There were also reports that a Russian Russian troops tried to enter Bogdanovka. The Ukrainians claimed that Bogdanovka, this attack on Bogdanovka, this advance on Bogdanovka, had been repelled. But later this morning, we got further news, and I have to say it's unconfirmed, again, might not be true, but we did get further news that Russian troops are now inside, that they've broken into Bogdanovka, and that they're cleaning up in this village. Now, this is a large village, at least on the map it looks large, so this might be a protracted battle. These battles for these villages can take quite a long time. If Bogdanovka is indeed on higher ground than Khromovo, it might be a difficult place to capture. I'm not saying that this battle for Bogdanovka is over, but it could be the case that the Ukrainians will counterattack and push the Russians back. We could see a protracted battle for this village. But for the moment, at least, it does look as if the Russians definitely have the upper hand here. And we're also getting further reports that the Russians are steadily now pushing the Ukrainians on the high ground near Klashevka, on the southern flank of Bakhmut. They do appear, the Russians do appear to have at least established a presence in Klashevka, probably Andreevka as well, almost certainly, in fact, in Andreevka as well. Gradually, they're pushing forward in these two places. So, again, to be very clear, we're not talking about a collapse of Ukrainian resistance in the Bakhmut area. We're not talking about any kind of rout. The Ukrainian military is still putting up a fierce fight around Bakhmut, but clearly the initiative has passed to the Russian side. And the same seems to be true in other places as well. We're now getting lots of reports from Kupiansk. Now, there were lots of reports over the last few days that the Russians entered Sinkovka, this village in the Sinkovka ledge, place which opens the gates for an advance to Kupiansk. Again, there were reports yesterday that the Ukrainians had counterattacked and had driven the Russians out of Sinkovka. There's been more reports, however, since then that the Russians have gained control of some of the tree lines around Sinkovka, increasing the perspective encirclement of this village. And then I saw further reports today, again from Russian sources, I want to stress, not Ukrainian ones, but from Russian sources, that in fact the Ukrainian attempt to drive the Russians out of Sinkovka was repelled, and that the Russians are indeed still in Sinkovka, though they so far only control a small part of this village. So it looks as if some kind of encounter battle for Sinkovka is still underway. It is clearly a very intense battle. The Ukrainians desperate to prevent a further Russian advance towards Kupiansk, and trying to counterattack, trying to stem the Russian advance. But again, the indications appear to be that the Russians around Sinkovka are still advancing. And there's also reports that the Ukrainians further to the west, to the southwest of Sinkovka and the lower ground, are actually pulling troops back from various villages and concentrating them on a tree line southwest of Kupiansk. I saw that Dima, the military summary channel, was suggesting that this might be because these troops are suffering from the extremely heavy bombing with cluster bombs and all those things that the Russians are undertaking in this area, and that may be true. And I wonder whether another possible reason is that the Ukrainian defense leadership, the people who are running Ukraine's defense in this area, are becoming increasingly worried that the situation in Sinkovka cannot hold for very much longer, that the Russians will finally break through and capture Sinkovka, and that will leave them in a position to move on to Kupiansk itself, and that in light of this, in order to prolong the defense of Kupiansk, and here I want to make it clear, I mean Kupiansk east of the Oskol River. There's another part of Kupiansk, the main residential area, which is west of the Oskol River, which so far the Russians don't seem to be looking to capture. But anyway, I wonder whether the idea is to try to concentrate as many troops in the immediate Kupiansk area as possible in order to maintain the defense there. So that might explain the withdrawal of troops to the tree line. So again, one gets the sense, and of course this is all sketchy, and there's an encounter battle clearly going on, and the Ukrainians are rushing reinforcements to Kupiansk. We've seen apparently Bradleys appear there, and also Abrams tanks are also there. But anyway, we see an encounter battle going on, but the Russians again seem to have the initiative. And they very evidently do have the initiative around Avdiivka. And here again, the main drama at the moment appears to be in the north. The Russians have been trying to push. They've now captured the industrial area to the south. They've been taking what looked to me to be the first serious steps to try to break into the bigger and denser industrial area to the north, where there's the coke factory and chemical factory and such things. They're apparently establishing some kind of footholds there. But of course, again, the bigger drama perhaps is happening further west, where it seems that the Russian forces, both to the southwest and northwest of Avdiivka, have been making further moves. Now, I recently in a program described the whole area in Avdiivka as a kind of sock, and there's been some reports that the Russians have been making significant advances in the heel area, if you like, of the sock, moving forward in that particular part. But there's also further reports today, and not always very easy to make a huge amount of sense of, but it does seem as if the Russians are steadily, gradually consolidating their positions west of the railway, and that they do seem to be intending to advance in that direction also. That's the railway northwest of Andreevka, the place, if you like, at the top end of the sock. And it's interesting that in Avdiivka, the Russians apparently are strong enough to attack in several directions at once. I've said this before, this has not been the general pattern in most of the offensives that the Russians have conducted up to this point. Usually, for example, in the Bakhmut battles, they concentrated on attacking and capturing one village at a time. In Avdiivka, they seem to be pushing hard from multiple directions, which is a sign, in my opinion, that they feel that they have an accumulation of strength in the Avdiivka area that enables them to do that. Now, last but not least, there's been some more reports from Krinky. This is, as I said, I discussed yesterday the exasperation and bafflement of some Russian reporters about why this bridgeheaded Krinky is still in existence. Well, it seems that the Russians have been launching more attacks on Krinky. There's photos now appearing of Krinky, the central area of Krinky, where these Ukrainian troops are located. It shows, again, another devastated landscape. The conditions that these Ukrainian troops who are still there in Krinky must be experiencing are difficult to imagine, being shelled and bombed and facing attacks by Russian flamethrower artillery all the time. And again, there's pictures which have now appeared of Russian vehicles with radios and with loudspeakers approaching Krinky, calling on the Ukrainian troops there to surrender. And a couple of days ago, leaflets were dropped on the Ukrainian troops in Krinky, again calling on them to surrender. It does seem as if the Russians are bringing up more forces towards Krinky. There was a report that the Russians used the period of the storm and the bad weather to redeploy forces to the Krinky area. So perhaps we will finally see a Russian attack intended once and for all to bring this story of this bridgehead to an end. Anyway, that's the situation on the battlefronts. As I said, not perhaps quite as dramatic as the situation yesterday, but then one would not expect it to be so. The Russians gain territory and then consolidate, and today probably is a day of consolidation. But if the reports from Bakhmut that the Russians have entered and are fighting in Bogdanovka are true, and if the Russians press forward with their attacks in Bogdanovka and are able to capture this village over the next few weeks, it will be consequential. And that brings me to the reason why the Russians are able to achieve these results, which in some respects are more spectacular and perhaps more consequential also than the results that the Ukrainians were able to achieve over the course of their long counteroffensive. And the reason that the Russians are able to do that, capture places like Bakhmut earlier this year, but also more recently, Khromovo, press forward around Avdiivka, do all of these things, is because the Ukrainians are running short of resources. To reiterate again, they're short of men, they're short of supplies, not just shells, but every conceivable sort of supplies. They lack air power. I've discussed in earlier programs how the Russians appear to have demolished what's left of the Ukrainian Air Force over the course of October. Every so often, again, one hears reports that the Ukrainians are trying to send some of their MiG-29s up into the air. But every day when that happens, one also gets reports of more Ukrainian aircraft being shot down, including now, I noticed, increasing numbers of Sukhoi 27s. Anyway, the Ukrainians are running short of men, machines, shells, apparently even of mines that they can lay. The only thing that they can produce in quantity are FPV drones, which they are able to make, I suspect, in makeshift factories in large numbers themselves. But as I said previously, FPV drones do not substitute for artillery shells, much less bombs, and they are vulnerable to jamming. And it is because of this shortage of men and equipment, that the Russians are able to continue their advances along the front lines. Now, in saying all of this, it's important to stress again that so far the Russians have not deployed the bulk of the forces that they have been assembling over the course of this year. So again, there's lots of speculation as to the exact number of Russian troops on the front lines. The Ukrainians guesstimate, the Ukrainian estimate is that there's around 400,000 Russian troops operating within the 1991 borders of Ukraine. And that does seem to be the general consensus, that we're talking about a force of around 400,000 Russian troops in Ukraine at the moment. Estimates of the number of Ukrainian troops on the front lines varies. But again, reports suggest there seems to be a kind of general consensus that it's somewhere in the ballpark of 300,000. So the Russians probably now outnumber the Ukrainians. They're not able to outnumber them by a decisive margin, right across the battle lines, but they're able to concentrate forces like they're just done in Avdiivka and are perhaps doing in Kupiansk, to an extent that the Ukrainians simply cannot do. They're able to stretch the Ukrainian lines, and of course their troops are relatively fresh. They've not been engaged in continuous offensives all of this year. They were on the defense for much of the year in Zaporozhye, Kherson and southern Donetsk. Their troops are relatively fresh, and they are being kept supplied with seemingly unlimited supplies, tanks, ammunition, armoured vehicles, artillery, and of course drones, of which the Russians appear to have, again, almost unlimited numbers, far more than the Ukrainians do. Now, I said the drones are vulnerable to jamming, but there have been a series of articles. I believe there was one in Forbes. It might have been somewhere else. But there have been articles in the American media that the Russians are much more successful in jamming Ukrainian drones than the Ukrainians are in jamming Russian drones. And I've also seen a report that the United States is very, very nervous about supplying Ukraine with anti-jamming equipment, with jamming equipment, because they're afraid that if that kind of equipment is supplied to Ukraine, and if the Russians capture it, or indeed even have to contend with it, the Russians will learn a great deal about how American jamming systems operate, and will no doubt share that information with the Chinese. So, the Russians outnumbering the Ukrainians on every part of the battlefront, equipped to levels that Ukraine is not equipped, and able to press on and continue their advances in all places, doing that which they've always said they would do, which is grind the Ukrainians down. Now, a couple of yesterday, Glenn Deason and I did on the Duran program, in which we interviewed Colonel Lawrence Wilkerson of the US military, who is, of course, Colin Powell's chief of staff. And I noticed that over the course of that program, Colonel Wilkerson brought up the topic of Clausewitz and said that the Russians, in their conduct of the war in Ukraine, had conducted Clausewitzian strategy. They not sought to capture cities or territory. Their major objective was to destroy the Ukrainian army, and through the destruction of Ukraine's army, to destroy ultimately Ukraine's ability to continue the war. Now, I can recall Alex Christoforou and myself at the Duran saying that the Russians would do exactly that very thing when the special military operation began. That it was not the Russian objective. We were saying this even at the time when the Russians were still camped outside Kiev, that it was not the Russian objective to seize cities, but to destroy the Ukrainian army. That the Russian military has been hardwired in terms of Clausewitzian thinking. It is part of its DNA, if you prefer. And, well, there we had Colonel Wilkerson say as much. And we've seen also how that is playing out on the battlefields. Now, I don't know how much longer this could continue for. But to reiterate again, a point I have made many times, a point also made by Brian Beletic as well at the New Atlas, this cannot continue indefinitely. The problems that Ukraine is facing in the face of this Russian avalanche of this war of attrition, of this Clausewitzian-style war that the Russians are waging against it, the problems that Ukraine is facing are insuperable. The United States and Europe are themselves now suffering from a shell shortage. They have not been able to keep Ukraine supplied with shells up to the kind of levels that Ukraine needs, not remotely. They have been massively overtaken by the Russians in terms of shell production, and that ignores the possibility that the Russians are also receiving shells from North Korea. And by the way, on that topic, Slavyangrad yesterday published photographs of the one factory in the United States, I believe it's somewhere in Pennsylvania, that actually makes shells. And one could see the problems. The workers looked, well, advanced in years. The machinery seemed very old. I would have thought that to renew and expand this factory and to increase shell production would take a significant amount of time and a very big commitment in resources. And it's difficult to see how, short of the United States imposing wartime conditions upon itself, that can be done in any kind of time frame necessary to change the situation in Ukraine. Moreover, I saw no sign that that was actually even happening, and I just understand that it is not actually happening. Now, about 2 days ago, there was a meeting of NATO foreign ministers. Lord Cameron, as he now is, our former Prime Minister, David Cameron, was there, and he said that Russia should not be allowed to outlast the West in Ukraine. He spoke about the West mobilizing all its vast industrial resources, its economic resources, to defeat the Russians in Ukraine. It's easy for someone like Cameron to say that. Cameron, somebody who has always, I suspect, seen things purely in terms of GDP totals and that kind of thing. But if you're talking about industry, manufacturing, management of industrial production, assembling components, sourcing raw materials, saying that the West can do it doesn't mean that the West will do it or will do it in any remotely acceptable time frame. So there we go. Speaking of David Cameron, I would say that way back into 2014, at the time of the 2014 crisis, I remember that he was the major advocate of cutting Russia off from SWIFT. He predicted then, apparently, I remember the discussions, he was the person who was going around telling everybody that if Russia was indeed cut off from SWIFT, its economy would implode. I doubt that this would have happened in 2014, by the way. I think the Russians would have found ways round, as they have with all the other sanctions. But anyway, come 2022, Russia was cut off from SWIFT. David Cameron got his wish, and of course the Russian economy did not implode. It effortlessly readjusted the messaging system, the interbank messaging system, set up by the Russian central bank, worked flawlessly and was able to take over without any sign of undue strain. And on that topic, by the way, I should say that there's been more comments by the Russia Central Bank Chair, Elvira Nabiullina, and she has made the point that the fundamental thing to understand about this particular crisis that was forced upon the Russians last year through the sanctions is that in this crisis, for the first time, Russia's financial system, its banking sector, has been able to work through without undue strain. The financial system has been so strengthened over the last decade that it has been able to absorb the sanctions shock and indeed continue growing. Now, Lord Cameron talked about the West outlasting Russia. We've had some more economic statistics from the Russians over the last couple of days. There's been some comments about Russian economic performance by Prime Minister Mikhail Mishustin. And he said that the Russian economy, he said this over the course of a meeting of the Russian government today. He said the Russian economy continues to develop despite external challenges. According to preliminary estimates from the Economics Ministry in January-October, gross domestic product grew 3.2%, and the strongest dynamics were observed in manufacturing, with growth at almost 7.5%. This is January to October. And he then went on to say that over 9 months, budget revenues, federal budget revenues, were 3% more than forecast, presumably when the budget was drawn up last year. And he said the decrease in revenues from the oil and gas sector due to the reconfiguration of logistics, an elegant way of saying the refocusing on Asia, the Asia-Pacific regions, India and China, was compensated for by the transfer of value-added and profit taxes, various excise taxes and other non-oil and gas payments, which was a consequence of increased business activity, the expansion of existing and the launch of new domestic production projects, which is a complicated way of saying that to the extent that there's been a decline in revenue from the oil and gas sector, it has been more than made up by increased tax revenue from the rapidly booming domestic economy. Now, it's not, of course, going to continue at this scintillating, this burning pace. The Economics Ministry says that GDP grew in October at 5% on an annualized basis. But it said that if you take away seasonal factors, there was actually a growth in September. The increase in GDP in October over GDP in September was 0.3%, whereas it had been 0.5% in September, so over the previous month. So that is probably a sign that the higher interest rates are now having the effect that they're intended to do, and that they are slowing the economy, presumably through slowing domestic demand, causing inflation finally to fall and to fall back to the central bank's target, 4% target. But anyway, for the moment, the Russian economy continues to grow very fast, and there is no reason to think that this is going to change. And by the way, and on the subject of oil and gas revenues, there's been all kinds of interesting information that the EU continues apparently to import liquefied natural gas from Russia at record levels, and OPEC Plus has now apparently agreed in principle a further 1 million barrel a day production cut, and this is to support the price of oil, which has been slipping in the last few months, largely because of the decline of the European economy. So more support for the oil price from OPEC Plus, which will probably ensure that Russian oil and gas revenues remain strong. Now, having said that, it's important to say that the Russians, most of their oil and gas now is being exported to China and to India. The United States has been pressing India to reduce its imports of Russian oil. And this has been very much the policy that the government of the United States has been trying to do. They've been trying to push India to change its policies with respect to Russia. But of course, what has also been happening is that relations between India and the United States have gradually been deteriorating. Now, the United States has again complained about attempts by the Indian security services to assassinate Sikh separatists. There was an incident about this in Canada a few weeks ago. There was a major row between the Indian and Canadian governments over this. But now we have a new incident which has taken place in the United States itself. It's not attracted in the Western media much attention, except in the Financial Times, but I will read about it. And this is what the Financial Times says. It says that US federal prosecutors have accused an Indian government official of orchestrating a plot to kill a Sikh activist in New York City. The allegations were contained in an indictment unsealed on yesterday, in which the United States Justice Department charged another Indian citizen with working with the official to carry out a murder-for-hire plot. The Indian official was not named or charged in the indictment. Although federal prosecutors did not name the target of the alleged plot, the Financial Times has confirmed that it was Gurpatwant Singh Panun, a dual US-Canadian citizen, who is General Counsel for Sikhs for Justice, a US-based group that is part of a separatist movement pushing for the creation of an independent Sikh state in India called Khalistan. And we have further comments from Justin Trudeau, the Canadian Prime Minister. He spoke on Wednesday on the back of this American indictment. He said that the Indian government needs to work with us to ensure that we're getting to the bottom of this. This is not something that anyone can take lightly. And we then go on to read that the US indictment filed in a federal court in Manhattan alleges the Indian government official, referred to as CC1, described himself as a senior field officer whose responsibilities include intelligence. It said the official directed the foiled plot from India, and the official allegedly recruited the Indian citizen charged in the indictment, identified as Nikhil Gupta, in May, by promising to arrange for criminal charges in India against him to be dropped. So, the United States and India seem to be heading for a quarrel. I have suggested in the past, at the time of the incident between India and Canada over the attempted assassination of a Sikh separatist leader in Canada, Hardeep Singh Nijjar, that what that was all about was that all these attempts to bring up Indian attempts, or alleged Indian attempts to assassinate Sikh nationalists or separatists, was an attempt by the United States to put pressure on the Indian government. I suspect that that is still the case, but we see that what it is actually doing is that it is causing relations between India and the United States to deteriorate instead of to improve. So, there we are. India will no doubt continue to import oil from Russia. It will probably decide that it needs to get closer to Russia over the next few weeks because of the pressure it is coming under in the United States. As I said many times, I believe that the United States is misjudging, again, Indian feeling over this particular issue and Prime Minister Modi's personal feelings over this issue specifically. So, there we go. Lord Cameron may think that the West can outlast the Russians. There is absolutely no reason to think, based on the economic realities, based on the diplomatic realities, that this is actually going to happen. And the United States and the Western powers don't seem to have any other answer to this problem. Foreign Minister Kuleba said yesterday, following the NATO meeting, this is Ukrainian Foreign Minister Kuleba, he said that Ukraine is not prepared to consider this idea floated by the former NATO Secretary General, Anders Fogh Rasmussen, of sacrificing its claim to Crimea in return for NATO membership. President Zelensky came out and supported Kuleba. He said that Ukraine still intends to recapture Crimea and Donbass. And the United States, the Western powers, don't seem to have any plan to push the Ukrainians into negotiations or to engage the Russians in negotiations themselves. All that we're left with, therefore, is Lord Cameron's words: we must outlast the Russians because we can't allow them to outlast us. Even The Economist today, I noticed, now has on its cover, for the first time, an admission, though it still qualifies that admission by putting a question mark. But it admits that Putin is actually winning the war in Ukraine. And by the way, the article within The Economist, which I'm not going to read, The Economist has a very, very tough policy on its paywalls. Anyway, this article specifically goes a lot further, and it actually does straightforwardly admit the reality that Russia is indeed winning the Ukraine war. Now, as to why the Ukrainian government, Zelensky and Kuleba and Yermak and all of these people cannot bring themselves to accept that the war is being lost, despite the cascading bad news from the battlefronts. Well, again, one has to take into account the bitter conflict between Zelensky and Zaluzhny. It seems that in Ukraine, a social movement has now been created, presumably with Zaluzhny's blessing, to protect Zaluzhny from potential dismissal. The Ukrainian government has made it very clear that it strongly disapproves of this social movement that is being created. One can see that the tensions between Zelensky and Zaluzhny, therefore, are continuing to grow. And given these tensions, it's unsurprising that Ukraine's government cannot risk publicly broaching the possibility of negotiations, lest by doing so it give its opponents, its domestic opponents, an opening which they could use against it. So we remain in that situation of what I call stasis, of political paralysis in Kiev, and we see how in the West, Western governments clearly have no plan forward. Ukraine won't agree to the proposals put forward by people like Richard Haass and others that Ukraine seek a freeze of the war, an option which the Russians have rejected. There's just no real idea or plan of how to go forward by anyone in the collective West. There is currently in North Macedonia, in Skopje, a meeting of the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. And after a complicated and winding journey, Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, was able to land in Skopje to attend this meeting. Various governments, including the one in Bulgaria, tried to obstruct his flight, giving all kinds of reasons for doing so. But anyway, he did eventually come with his delegation. And I noticed that over the course of his visit to Skopje, Lavrov had a meeting with the Austrian foreign minister. So maybe Austria, where there will be elections next year, which the Freedom Party, which opposes the support for the conflict in Ukraine, is likely to win. Anyway, the Austrian foreign minister looks like he might be, under that kind of domestic political pressure, trying to start some kind of dialogue with the Russians. But so far as I can see, no one else is prepared to do that. And if the Austrian foreign minister acted to some extent on behalf of the other Western and European states, I wonder, to be frank, to what extent Lavrov anyway would be receptive to anything that he had to say. For the record, European some European representatives walked out of the OSCE meeting whilst Lavrov spoke. Lavrov did have another meeting, apparently, with the foreign minister of Armenia to discuss the situation with Armenia's membership of the CSTO and the conflict with Azerbaijan. The president of Azerbaijan, Ilham Aliyev, has now warned the United States that the United States' support for Armenia is now damaging US relations with Azerbaijan. But anyway, I don't get the sense of any real sustained diplomatic initiative taking place. So, we are in the early days of winter. The weather is falling. The Rasputitsa is ending. The Russians have used the period of the Rasputitsa to make significant, though not yet dramatic, gains. Avdiivka looks very vulnerable. Large forces are gathering in Kupiansk. The Russians are advancing in Bakhmut, and the West generally remains paralyzed, as does Ukraine, where a complex and difficult to understand power struggle is playing out. I've said this before, I'm going to just repeat it one more time. I've never known such a total failure of diplomacy in my lifetime. Henry Kissinger, the old monster who died yesterday, in his last days and weeks, must have been close to despair as he saw all of his work, his attempts to establish dialogue with the Russians, and by the way, with the Chinese too, as he's been seeing all of that unravel. And I am sure that deep down, somewhere in himself, he must have been utterly frustrated by the inability of Western leaders to put together a coherent plan to extricate the West from the disaster in Ukraine, such as the one that Kissinger did put together in order to extricate the United States from its catastrophe in Vietnam all those decades ago. Anyway, that is the situation in the Ukraine conflict as I see it today. I'll just finish this program by turning to an important development in the Middle East, which actually happened some days ago. The USS Eisenhower, the US Navy carrier, has now passed the Straits of Hormuz and is in the Persian Gulf. However, I still get the sense that any enthusiasm, in fact, the plan, which I have no doubt originally existed and which was formed back in October, to use the crisis in Gaza to launch some kind of strike on Iran. Anyway, I think that plan has, for the moment at least, been abandoned, and the enthusiasm for it has melted away. On the contrary, exactly as we suggested on the Duran, the United States seems to be desperate to try to bring the conflict in Gaza to an end. It is clearly advocating for further extensions of the ceasefire in Gaza, even though it's finding it very difficult to bring its Israeli ally into line. The administration is doing this, having understood the catastrophic effect on the US's standing caused by the conflict that has played out in the last few weeks in Gaza. I could use much stronger language, but I'm not going to, because obviously there are sensitivities which I'm afraid I have to respect. Anyway, for me, the presence of the Eisenhower in the Persian Gulf is a sign of the original deployment plans that must have been agreed when the order to send it to the Middle East were made back in early October at the start of the crisis. And I suspect that it's taken the Eisenhower time to reach its deployment station in the Persian Gulf. But I suspect that that was the plan in October. And the plan in October was that when it did reach the Persian Gulf, it would be poised together with the Gerald Ford in the Eastern Mediterranean to launch simultaneous airstrikes and missile strikes. The Eisenhower and the Ohio-class submarine with its Tomahawk cruise missiles, also in this area, in the Persian Gulf area, launching the strikes against Iran. The Gerald Ford in the Eastern Mediterranean, supported by the Israeli Air Force, launching the strikes against Hezbollah. Now that, I am sure, was the plan. That it has not been implemented is more than anything else the product of the successful diplomacy carried out by the Arab and Muslim states, backed by the BRICS in the United Nations over the last few weeks. It's a topic that we have discussed at further length in the Duran, or in a video that we have just done in the Duran. I think that when the history of this incident is finally written down and published, we will find out how close to a war between the United States and Iran in October we actually came. Anyway, that is where I end my program today. More from me soon. Let me remind you again that you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble, X. You can also support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar. Links under this video. You can also check out our shop. See the amazing things that you will find there. The magic mugs, the hats, the hoodies, the t-shirts, all those great things. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.